Well, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Tuesday. My name is Andre Lighty Walker. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Policy Transformation Manager here at the Street Trust. I just wanted to say good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of the Oregon Active Transportation Summit. I'd like to welcome you all to Bike Data and Equity, uncovering the implications for data and people. We're going to have a great session today, and I can't wait to dive in. Our presenters will be taking questions following their presentation. And if it's easier for you to track, feel free to type your questions in the chat as they emerge. But do note, we'll be holding those for the end. And if any immediate concerns arise, feel free to message me directly. You're all in for a treat today. I'm honored to welcome our international guests, Carly Ross from the University of Calgary and Molly Bennett of Bike Calgary, and I will let them take it from here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. We're extremely excited to be here. So before we begin today, in the spirit of telling the truth about our colonial histories, I want to acknowledge that Molly and myself are joining you from Treaty 7 in Canada. We live, work, enjoy the landscape, and ride our bikes in Mohkinstsis, which is the place now called Calgary. This is the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani, as well as the traditional territory of the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda nations. This is also the territory of Métis Nation, Region Number 3. So I acknowledge all of the people who live and make their homes in this my home, Treaty 7 in Southern Alberta. So as stated, I am KJ Ross. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a graduate student in computational media design at the University of Calgary. I am housed in computer science in the Data Experience Lab under the co-supervision of Dr. Wesley Willett and Dr. Pratim Sengupta. So I study how we construct, analyze, and represent data relating to active mobility. And so my particular interest is in bicycle mobility because I love riding bikes, and I am particularly focused in data on what we don't collect and how we can represent the things that we don't collect. So today I'm going to be presenting part of an ongoing project that is intended to start unfolding equity issues across both data and mobility infrastructures. But before we begin, I want to give Molly Bennett, who is one of my favorite people to ride my bike, think, and discuss active mobility with, an opportunity to introduce herself.
Thanks, KJ. My name is Molly and my pronouns are she, her. I am an avid year-round commuter cyclist here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I am the president of Bike Calgary. So in my volunteer time, I am an advocate for building human-centered cities, primarily focused on cycling as a mode of active transportation, but of all kinds of walking, wheeling, and transit options are big passions of mine. I'm also lucky enough to have bikes as a part of my work in my day job. So I work for a small nonprofit here in town called Two Wheel View, and we do bicycle-based programming for youth and young adults in our city. And so it's fair to say that I'm pretty passionate about bikes and pretty excited to be here to add some context to KJ's research from the perspective of advocacy that I share with KJ. And so I'm excited to be here and to have a conversation with you folks after our presentation about some of these things.
Well, thank you so much, Molly. So today, this presentation will kind of be in 3 broad parts, followed by a discussion. The first thing I'm going to do is kind of frame some of how I approach my work, and then I'm going to explain how I've approached a current project and some of the results that have come up with that project. To wrap up, Molly is going to give some context to this project in terms of how this kind of impacts and affects advocacy, and we'll discuss some of the implications of data for citizen participation and for resident participation, and kind of why this matters for both advocates and residents and planners and the whole all of us. So I do recognize that my work is situated in visual representations of information, and so I understand that may limit accessibility. I will do my best to provide good descriptions as I can. I also understand that the visual representations that I am providing are very rooted in historically European and colonial representations of space. So I want to begin by telling you a story that kind of brought me to where I am today. About 4 years ago, I decided to attend a hackathon that was put on by our city, the city of Calgary. This hackathon suggested that we should come together to use open data to encourage and improve walking in the city. Now, this sounded great to me. Active mobility and data, these are two of my favorite things. So naive and overly optimistic me shows up at this hackathon thinking about route finding, pathways, curb cuts, snow and ice clearing. All of these things are really important. And I was really keen to see what I could piece together based on the information that was publicly available. But instead of being inspiring, this hackathon ended up being rather frustrating. My team and I would come up with an idea and then bam, we would hit a brick wall. There is no publicly available data about that. A light bulb moment in terms of access to data came on for me when we started looking for a data set about on our local data portal to tell us about the extent and distribution of sidewalks in the city. No sidewalk data exists. And not only is this data not available on our data portal, when I talked to some of the planners at the event, it's actually not available to them either. Sidewalk location and extent is not data that has been historically collected in Calgary because we are an extremely car-oriented city. And so this actually has implications for how we can think about and engage in conversations relating to pedestrian mobility. If we don't know where there's sidewalks, it's really difficult to then connect the missing links or make those sidewalks more accessible. So I kind of took a step back and had to mull this over for a while. And then recently I returned to graduate school to do research on this topic. And so my current work is what this talk today is about. And this talk today is about the intersection between bicycles and bicycle use, equity and justice, as well as data. And so we're going to talk about what happens when we try to engage residents and publics with all of these issues kind of at the same time. So I'm going to provide a bit of framing and defining some terms to get us going. So to begin with, I kind of had to take a step back and say, so what is it that I'm interested in thinking about, in talking about, and in exploring? And so some key questions that came up are, how accessible and useful is open data for citizen or public use? And what challenges are existing in using open data for public use? And then when we deal with, represent, and talk about active mobility, and we're trying to use data to do this, how do the things that we don't collect, data absences and data exclusions, impact our ability to support equitable access to active transportation? Now that's a big question, and I don't claim I'm anywhere near answering that right now. But what I have done is taken a bit of another step back and said, okay, so when we do want to analyze or do an analysis or do a presentation with data and information that has been historically excluded or is currently excluded and is not available, what can I do to include this result in our presentation? So what I'm interested in doing is highlighting that what is absent or included from counting is a choice. So I want to talk about some key terms. Data. We've heard it a lot today. We've heard it a lot yesterday. There are many different ways that we can define data. It's actually a very deep philosophical question, and I'm not going to go there, although I enjoy those conversations. It could, for example, be information output or factual information or measurements used to make a reasoned decision. It could be looked at as information that can be transmitted or processed using a computer. The question of what is data is so deep, and that it really kind of lies at the heart of what we think about the world, and there's a lot of cultural implications for that. In this project in specific, I am defining data as information that I can use to present visual representations that will support reasoned decision-making about active mobility. And the data sources I am using are open data portals. This does not mean that I think this is the only type of data that is valid. It means that this is where I'm focusing my interest right now, for the reasons that Molly will get into later. Okay, so now I've thrown out this other term, open data. What is this? Some of you may be familiar with it, others may not. So in the past decade and a half or so, as we've seen an increase in digital technologies, we've also seen an increase in people having data collected about them. Some of this data is collected by governments and some is collected by private companies. So Strava is an example of a private company that collects data, and that data is actually owned by them. However, in the open data movement suggests that governments who are collecting data about people are collecting it using taxpayers' dollars, and that the people should have access to that data to engage with and participate in their democracy and their democratic systems. And so open data is a movement that strives to make that happen. And the goals of open data broadly are that it needs to be available and accessible, it needs to be reusable, and that there should be a universal availability to that data. The last kind of nebulous term that we throw around a lot is what is equity? And what is equity and justice, again, can be very situated in perspective, in experience, and how you're trying to create a lens for a particular project. In this particular project, I'm really using a very simplistic definition of equity, where I'm looking at whether or not there is equality in distribution of collection across different locations. That's a very reductive definition of equity, and I acknowledge that, but it is also the one I am using. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how I have approached this current project. So I started by saying, okay, well, there's all these kind of big ideas that are floating around in my head. So what can I do about this? And I said, well, maybe I can ask some questions and see if I can answer them using the data portals for different cities. And so my question structure, I wanted it to be simple. I wanted the questions to provide insights, and I wanted the questions to also highlight gaps that may exist in either mobility infrastructure or in data infrastructure. And so my question focuses were on bike infrastructure, bike use, and population distributions. So I'm going to do a quick run through of the questions, and the slides are available with the types of data that I was using. I don't want to focus too much on that. That's a deeper level thing. So the first question is, what is the distribution of bike parking in a given city? And then I wanted to know, at a ward level, does there appear to be a relationship between visible minorities and the distribution of bike parking in a city? Now, when I use the word ward level, this was coming from my Canadian context. We tend to separate our municipalities into what we called wards, which is like multiple communities in one area. As I got into the data, I realized this was actually a terrible question, but this is what I started with. The third question was similar to the second question. Is there a relationship between the distribution of socioeconomic status and bike parking in the city? The fourth question switched themes a bit and focuses on the distribution of protected bike infrastructure in cities. The fifth on the distribution of protected bike infrastructure in relationship to visible minority status. And then the sixth in relationship to socioeconomic status. The seventh question asks, what is the distribution of bike use across the city? And so we'll talk about how this is something we talk about a lot in Canada, where people are using bikes. And then what is the distribution of bike use in counting locations across the city? And does that relate to visible minority status? And does that relate to socioeconomic status? So those are the questions I was interested in asking. Now I want to take a step back and comment on the categories I'm using, and particularly the categories around race. The categories around race that I'm using have been defined by both the American and the Canadian census. And these categories are deeply rooted in Eurocentric views of people and of identity, and are extremely problematic and rather racist in a lot of ways. I've done work with some of my colleagues elsewhere on this topic, particularly my colleague Priya Daka and my supervisor, Dr. Wesley Willett, to try and kind of unpack how categories around race do cause harm. What we do know is that they tend to make people identify in categories that they don't necessarily self-identify as. So I want to make that note. I am using census categories because this is the publicly available data. These categories are not necessarily ideal. We hope they're changing, but we also need to have some accountability for that change. So as I move forward, I'm going to be presenting information in a common format on my slides. I chose to answer these questions using 4 different data portals for 4 different cities. So I chose Halifax, which is when I have a screenshot of the data portal for Halifax on the top left-hand corner of the slide. Portland, because I am speaking to you, Oregon, and I was interested what's happening here. And so you'll be located on the top right-hand corner of the slide. Toronto, I have a screenshot of Toronto's open data portal on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. And then, of course, my hometown, which is Calgary, Alberta, on the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. So as we move forward, I will be telling a story of these 4 cities. So one of the things that played into this city selection was city size. These are the city sizes according to the enumerations on the open data portals. They're not necessarily reflective of the actual metropolitan sizes in the city. This is who is included in the data in the open data portals. Toronto is represented by a large circle, Calgary, smaller circle, Portland, smaller circle, and Halifax is a smaller circle with the populations across the cities. And the reason that I chose these different cities and different locations in Canada is that different governance structures actually make for different types of policies, both in terms of data infrastructure and in terms of bicycle infrastructure. And so in the Canadian context in specific, I chose cities that occur in different provinces because the way our governance structure works here is that the provinces have complete control over how cities are governed. So at any time, a province can say, no, we want you to go do this city, and we'll see an example of this later, and that will actually impact the way in which the city is governed or the kinds of choices that the city can make. And so I chose cities, Halifax, Toronto, and Calgary from 3 different provinces to reflect this. I was also interested in different cities that reflected different representations and different kind of population dynamics. Toronto is the most diverse city in Canada, and I wanted to compare that to Calgary and Halifax, but that data is not available on our local open data portals. So this is the beginning of starting to see where this work goes. And finally, I'm interested in what happens in different cities with different infrastructures. And so in Calgary, we have the most bicycle pathways of any city in North America. This is a source of pride for us, but we don't necessarily have great connected infrastructure. So that was how I kind of framed the project. And now I'm going to go into talking about when I'm trying to represent this information, what happens. So the first thing I was looking at, if you remember, was bike racks and bike parking. And so on this slide, I have a series of maps that represent both the distribution of visible minorities in each respective city according to the colors. So on the right-hand side, on the upper right-hand side, I have a map of Portland, and on the lower right-hand side, I have a map of Toronto. Both of these cities have a color scale that ranges from a light teal to a dark teal, depending on the regions of the city, depending on the percentage of visible minorities in a particular region of the city. On the left-hand side of the slide, on the top, I have a map of Halifax in brown. There is no information about bike parking, and there is no information about the distribution of visible minorities in the city of Halifax. And this is actually really notable because Halifax has one of Canada's oldest Black communities in the area of East Preston. And so no representation here, not having that present so that can be accounted for in planning does make a difference. And then in the bottom corner, I have Calgary also in brown because visible minority distribution is not included in this slide either. And in the middle of that slide, there is a series of 6 small dots. And I've put a little teal circle around these 6 small dots because supposedly that is our bike parking in Calgary. So the City of Calgary Open Data Portal only provides 6 locations for bike parking in the whole city. And that's because they only track bike parking in parkades. So I want to dig into what's happening in Toronto a little bit, because it looks, I look at this and I'm like, okay, there's something happening here with distribution of bike racks and the visible minority status across the city. That's my first kind of instinct. But then I had to take a step back and remember I said that whole thing about provinces and policy before. Now, the city of Toronto is actually comprised of what was historically 6 distinct cities that all had 6 distinct local councils. And so in the 1990s, the province of Ontario decided that these 6 distinct cities, as are outlined in the red here, should all be amalgamated together into one large city as the city of Toronto, or the greater metropolitan area of Toronto. And so while the distribution of bike racks is what I expect based on our desire to try and improve mobility in more core urban centers, when I look at particularly the right-hand side of the screen, so for those who need a description, on this map in the kind of center of the city of Toronto, there's a lake shore, and the center of the city sits right on the lake shore, and there's a whole bunch of bike racks located there. And then as you move out, the density of the bike racks decreases. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, there is an area of the city of Toronto that used to be the city of Scarborough that has a very high percentage of visible minorities in it, one of the highest regions of visible minorities in the entire country of Canada, and not a lot of bike rack distribution according to the data. But because of this historical policy distinction, this becomes really tricky. I don't know if what's happening here is that the other municipalities in the greater Toronto area didn't used to collect bike rack data, kind of like Calgary didn't used to collect sidewalk data, or if this is that there is a difference in distribution of public bike racks in these regions. And so this is what this is one of the tricky things about using publicly available data to make decisions. And so this is a map of the city showing the distribution that I described. So then what I decided I needed to do is I needed to kind of dig a bit deeper into this information. And so on this graph, along the vertical axes, I have the number of bike parking locations that have been recorded in the city in the open data portal. Along the bottom, I have the total number, the median income of households according to the most recently available census data. And then I have a gradation of shades, again, from light to dark teal. And this is representing the percentage of people who have identified in the most recently available census as being a visible minority. And what we see when we plot these 3 things together, so when we try to do a more intersectional plot between both visible minority status and income, is that we do have a bit of a cluster of very low counts in the population in Toronto that is high percentage of visible minorities and lower median incomes. And so this does sort of represent what I think a lot of us already know about mobility infrastructure or data infrastructure. But I think it's also important to recognize that this is part of how we can use data to advocate for more equitable infrastructure. I then took the map of Portland, which again has a high density of bike racks in the downtown area, and then kind of spreads out from there. And I did the same kind of plot with household median income along the bottom axes, the number of bike rack locations or bike parking locations that have been recorded in the open data portal along the vertical axes, and then a color gradient based on the percentage of visible minority. This is actually a percentage of non-white or Hispanic individuals in Portland according to the open data portal census. And so it appears to have a similar distribution, but it's not quite as distinct as that which we see in Toronto. So to summarize, Portland and Toronto actually have a lot of information about bike parking available. How complete that information is difficult for me as it would be difficult for me as an advocate to claim. Calgary and Halifax don't really have anything to say about this. And so as I'm playing with how I represent this, what I have kind of started playing with is representing a darkened, empty graph, which I have visualized on this screen with an annotation that notes that Halifax doesn't have any records, so I can't say anything. So the next thing I looked at was the bike routes. And, you know, we've talked a lot about different types of bike infrastructure, and I think that that's a really important conversation to have. What I notice here is that Halifax, which is on the top right of the screen, doesn't really have a lot. I've coded these in different colors. Halifax, there's a few lines that are not very well connected at all. On the top right of the screen, I have mapped Portland from the open data set of Portland of bike routes, and it is just a massive color. I am impressed, but I'm not sure I can fully understand the map, which I will get to in a minute. On the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, I have a map of Calgary. We have a lot of infrastructure present compared to the other two Canadian cities. It's a lot denser distribution of infrastructure according to my visual interpretation. But if I were to zoom into this map, you would actually see a lot of disconnection. And then in Toronto, when we look at Toronto, similar to Halifax, there seems to be a lot of kind of big empty spaces in the map, but there is also more connectivity in the downtown core. So I had wanted to look at these distributions in terms of what I can take from the open data portals and kind of filter out, so what do we know about what is protected bike infrastructure? However, in order for me to do that as if I were trying to engage in using this information as a citizen or as a resident, becomes really difficult in Portland because the open data portal in Portland doesn't actually provide me the codes of what the different infrastructure stands for. Now, as somebody with more domain knowledge, I could probably make a guess about the difference between TRL and BBL, but this actually becomes a data quality problem that makes it not universally accessible. And so then finally I was interested in looking at bike use. And so here I've got 4 maps again. I've got a map of Halifax that shows our bike to work metric. Now the bike to work metric, very problematic, not the ideal metric. It is actually the only Canada-wide metric that we have because it's collected in the Canadian census. However, Halifax is the only of the 3 Canadian cities that provide this census information on their open data portal, and so that is why I have mapped Halifax using that data here. Calgary has 2 different ways that we have counted how people use bikes. We use sensors that kind of record how often people are cycling in an area. And we also have done cordon counts where we send people out and have enumerated how many people are using different modes of transportation. And so here I have mapped the sensors that Calgary has onto that brown background. Toronto also does these cordon counts, like where you go out and measure people. They have 68 locations. All 68 of those locations are really centered in the downtown core. And on this map, it's centered again closer to the waterfront in a rectangle near the downtown core. And well, I would guess that Portland has information about this. I was not able to find any information about counts and use on the Portland Open Data Portal myself. So to dig a bit deeper into this in my context, which is Calgary, this actually left multiple wards in our city with low or no counting. And because I know my region, I look at these wards, and again, wards are like a region in a city. And I'm like, whoa, there's something weird going on. Well, first of all, these are all more suburban areas, so that at first doesn't seem so bizarre from how we think about how we do active transportation and mobility planning. But when I go and collect the visible minority distribution data from elsewhere on the City of Calgary's website, what does show up is that we have not counted in the wards that have the highest percentage of visible minorities. And so there is this exclusion that is happening. So I am going to stop because I can talk and talk and talk about data and information and presentations. I'm going to pass it off to Molly, who will provide some context to what we're talking about here today.
Thanks so much, KJ. I really enjoy having the opportunity to hear you speak about your project and your perspectives and your context there. And it always gives me something to think about from my own unique context. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm an advocate. And as an advocate for cycling and active transportation and human-centered cities, I often find myself focused more on the end state goal of equitable access to transportation options for everyone in a way that is getting transportation systems built and missing links connected and improving the lives of folks that live in our city. But I think that focus often leads me to be moving fast and working within a system that is moving fast. And this creates like sort of a sense of urgency that I experience in my advocacy. And of course, we know and have discussed over the last couple of days, these things are urgent. Active transportation options and well-designed cities can solve all kinds of problems that are urgent for our citizens and for the world at large. And I think that it is important to remember and appreciate the value of slowing down and thinking critically about these kinds of things. And how we can center the human beings in it as we talk about advocacy and data and those kinds of things. So as I said, I'm an advocate and specifically an advocate for cycling. And so I do some of my work for that through an organization called Bike Calgary. We're a volunteer run advocacy organization that's local to Calgary here. And one of our roles, as I see it, is to shift the larger lens of everyone who lives in the city and shift everyone from those that are already biking to those who may someday join or who may never, who will always be transit users or walkers or folks that drive cars, but allowing all of us to shift our lens to believe and understand that active transportation is a right for all that live in the city, and having access to transportation option and infrastructure that allows people to easily move around their cities is a fundamental right and a requirement for building cities for people. And so as an advocate that is trying to shift that lens and shift that viewpoint in my city, one of the tools that I use is data. So I come back to this idea of data. And we know that data is a really important tool because it's one of the key languages that is spoken in our society when it comes to decision making and how we spend our money and what policies we make. And so in the context of this presentation and this conversation, I wanted to think about some of the pressures and traps that are faced by anyone who is trying to work toward building human scaled cities as they relate specifically to data. And so some of the common traps that I feel like I come up against, and others might as well, is issues of access to high quality open source data, issues of literacy, issues of pressures that I feel as an advocate in the system that I'm in, and the challenge of the nuances of the system that I operate in. So the first of that is access to high quality data. And that one I think is fairly straightforward and well illustrated by Carly's earlier points in the presentation. And so basically what we're saying here is that in order to use data as an advocate, you need to access it. It needs to be available. And so you saw quite strikingly in some of those visualizations that KJ had on the screen that we are looking at different places, and we're seeing that sometimes you can't even access the data. It doesn't even exist. So how do you have a conversation about something if you can't even access it? And so if I was wanting to speak to one of my key stakeholders, perhaps a counselor, a city employee, a news outlet, or maybe just an everyday citizen whose lens I'm trying to shift a little on how they see these issues, it's complicated to talk to them about data that I don't have access to. And as we know, the access of data, the absence of data can show us something. If there's no data, that still tells us something. But in a split second, when I have only a few moments to talk to a media outlet or a few moments to talk to an elected official, sometimes what the language that they speak and what they want is hard, fast, simple data that I have to be able to access. And if I access it, and if I can access it, and if it's well done on my open portal for my city or for the area I'm advocating for, I have to be able to understand it. I need to have data literacy in order to understand, use, and share data appropriately and safely. And I'll say really honestly and openly that I have lots of skills as an advocate that I bring to the table, and I'm proud of them and aware of them. But I wouldn't say that data literacy is one of my greatest strengths. And so this is an issue that I feel I come up against, where I want to make sure that I'm not just looking at data and agreeing with it or disagreeing with it because of my own biases or my own worldview. I want to be able to actually really understand it, and I want to be able to communicate it to others and those stakeholders that I was talking about effectively. And so part of that is, trying not to do any harm as I'm layering on an equity lens to those kinds of things. So that's the data side of it. Then I feel like it's these pressures to prove things that I operate in. And so in a Canadian context, in a Calgary context, I'm often feeling that we still need to prove the need for the use of and the need and the enjoyment of bicycles and other active modes for folks. So still being asked to prove that people are in fact wanting to use these kinds of modes of transportation and that they are using them. Still being asked to show the data and prove things that are not always easy and straightforward to prove. An example of this is that our federal counterpart here in Canada is Bello Canada Bikes, and they're launching a program in the last couple of years called Pedal Poll. And from their website, they describe it as a chance to evaluate the state of cycling in our communities. Together, we'll get a snapshot of what cycling looks like in communities across Canada at the same time, at the same way, year over year. So essentially, Pedal Poll is going to station volunteers across the country to observe cyclists passing by and collect data on who's biking and where. There's lots of this that's really great. It's a chance for people to engage, to participate, and a chance to get a snapshot of cycling as they suggested. But it has also got some problems in it. So Pedal Poll is also asking volunteers to record a perceived age, gender, and ethnicity of each cyclist that they count. And we know that they're using some government and human rights best practices as they make these decisions. But we also know, as KJ mentioned with the census data, that these things come from a big source. And when that big source is distilled down, we know that there are still some inherited problems with the way we use these kinds of methods for data collection and for looking at these kinds of things. So we could get into the ethics of citizen science and all kinds of interesting things, but I'll try not to get off on too much of a tangent, and I'll bring it back to my point here, which is basically just that I'm curious about why, in a Canadian context, and I would wager in a North American context as well, we are still being asked to prove that people are riding and that people want to ride. We're still being asked to get that data, and we're still being asked to collect it ourselves as volunteers. And so I wonder instead if we would argue a point that's a little more nuanced, a little more in line with some of what KJ was presenting, that if we believe that having access to multimodal transportation is a right and a failure to provide infrastructure that isn't acting as a gentrifying force in communities is a failure of government. If we believe that to be true, should we not be then focused on the idea of questioning where we have put the infrastructure, where we haven't put the infrastructure, what people in the community desire, and then what we know about demographic distribution and how those things relate. And then we could start to have a more nuanced conversation about who's being left behind and who has been included in having access to this fundamental right of multimodal transportation. And so that's a pressure that we feel. This pressure to count is not allowing us to ask such nuanced questions. Another quick pressure I'll note before we wrap up here is just the pressure that I feel as an advocate, and I'm just, speaking from my own personal experience here, but the pressure to support and not criticize anything cycling related or active transportation related, walking, wheeling, transit, all these kinds of things. Anything that might have a slightly pro-cycling argument or will be good for calming traffic, I am expected to support wholeheartedly. And we know that limited resources exist. And so in Calgary, active transportation options and infrastructure for walking and wheeling has come a long way. We've got lots of things to be proud of, and we should celebrate those successes for sure. But we also know that when we look at the money being spent on projects, the car-centric city projects still get way more support and funding than any of these active mobility options do. And so we want to be critical of that, but we also want to be aware that we have limited resources. And so I think it can create this environment where we as advocates, and I would suggest anybody working towards city building, are forced into an anything we can get mentality versus a be critical and build the best we can in the best way, in the most holistic way for our whole city. I think a great example of this is that I am privileged enough and lucky enough to be able to have chose to live and rent in an area of the city where getting around by my bike is possible. I'm centrally located and I can get to lots of places easily by bike. And that's why I chose to live here. And I'm lucky to be able to make that choice. Not everybody can make that choice. But then I see improvements in that area of active mobility happening in my area, in the inner city. And of course, I want to be really excited and applaud these kinds of things. And I do, they're great. There's lots of them that are really well done and are going to improve the lives of people living in our area. But I also want to be able to ask why that's happening not only, but mostly in some of these more central communities and central areas. And so I believe that this pressure can be there where I don't want to alienate or criticize or cause any harm to my partners in the city and other places where people are making decisions, I think, with the best interest of the city in mind. But I want to be able to criticize where we're spending our limited resources and ask those nuanced questions about distribution of infrastructure as it relates to other demographic information in our city. And this pressure to always be in support of any kind of infrastructure or data project or anything like that that might be pro-cycling is a trap that I feel like I fall into. So those are sort of the high level thoughts that I have on those traps around access to data literacy, and then the unique pressures and nuances of advocacy. So that's what stands out for me after hearing some of your work, KJ.
Well, thank you so much, Molly. Every time I listen, first of all, I'm always thrilled that you like understand the critical lens that I'm trying to approach data through. So thank you. And I really value and appreciate your insight on our local context and how this connects to my work. So my hope is for those of you who are attending today that coming from this talk, I think it's hard to say, well, here's all the problems, but I think, and not have some kind of solutions. And so for me, the solutions are these, that when we're looking at data and when we're using data, we like to look at it as objective. This is well researched in my domain, in my field of study, where we research the perceived objectivity of things that are actually politically constructed. And so I hope that what you take away today is that bike data, active mobility data more broadly, is politically constructed. It is constructed by a series of choices. And when we're trying to use that data, we're also really constrained by the systems that we're functioning within. And so it's important to be mindful of that political construction of the data, but also as kind to ourselves about those constraints as possible. So largely, if you leave today, and I hope we can have a bit of a conversation moving forward here now, but if you leave today kind of having a bit more critical thinking about how we're using data in your own practice or in your own life, then that will make me very happy. So at this point, we would like to open it up if you have any questions, thoughts, and particularly if you have any reflections about your own particular context or your own particular practice and experience. We'd like to open up the floor, and I do invite you to turn on your cameras at this point if you feel comfortable doing so.
Just wanted to quickly say thank you again, both. That was absolutely amazing, and super excited for this next portion. So question-wise, I think we could use the raise hand feature if you wanted to like visually ask it. And then also the chat room is an option as well. Make sure I have mine pulled up. Accidentally, sorry about that.
I am going to stop sharing just so,
okay,
for now at least.
So I actually, well, I'm happy to open up with a question that I have listed, and which either one of you feel free to take it or both take it as well. So what do you think some of the biggest barriers to entry with data and the data visualization might be? And what advice would you give to advocacy groups or just a community member that's interested but like terrified by the process?
I guess I'm answering that. Hey, Molly.
I'll add something if I've got anything after.
I think the biggest barrier is really this kind of dual issue. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's a combination of access and literacy. So if you don't have the data literacy to use an open data set and to produce a visualization with it, if you don't have any data to produce that with, that becomes a problem. But if you're then using data that you don't understand, maybe is not complete, or if you assume that it's just completely objective, then you could get into the issue that I was trying to highlight in Toronto, where there's a whole bunch more context there. And so then in terms of advocacy, if you're trying to present that to like your city and you don't understand that that context could exist, that's going to actually like impede your use of data. And so I I love data. I think it's great. I think we need tools that simplify data presentation and the use of open data, which is where I'm hoping to maybe take some of my research, because I don't think we have a lot of platforms for making that available to advocates right now. So usually to get into this, what you end up having to do is, like, I used Tableau, which is a commercially available data tool. I have access to it because I'm a student. I didn't have access to it for a long time. Prior to this, I was using Python. I'm comfortable coding, most people aren't. And so that all of those technical skills create barriers, which then create barriers to accessing and using data with the city. And what I think is really problematic about that is that a lot of those technical skills are also reflections of other systemic privileges. And so this becomes this like kind of feedback loop when we're looking at doing advocacy. If you're dealing with this, if you're saying, well, we want the data to show that what you're saying is true, and we're over privileging a very, very quantitative type of data and underprivileging qualitative data, which at least in our Calgary experience is the experience that we overprivilege one type of data. So I can go with an anecdote, and that anecdote to me as an advocate and to me as somebody who thinks a lot about data should probably have as much weight in terms of how advocacy is working, but that's not how our advocacy work tends to play out, because we want to be proving things. And so then it lands on citizens to prove things that they're not necessarily equipped or skilled to do, which actually I think just creates another barrier to creating active mobility. So I don't have a good answer for you. You have asked, I think, one of the cruxes of the crux of the question of the open data movement is if access and literacy continue to be a problem, then does providing a bunch of data actually help to equalize things, or does it just allow people who already have privilege and access to become more privileged and have more access because there are no financial barriers? I don't have a good question to answer to that, but I think you've asked a brilliant question.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I did want to open up the floor. And I do have a follow-up on that note quickly, because I'm seeing there's also agency folks in this chat right now. And so do either of you think that government agencies should play a role in that sort of education of the people? If so, to what extent in your dream world? And if not, why not?
I think that I think that data literacy should be a universally accessible skill that students are taught in school. And so I think that is this is an education problem. One of my supervisors is situated in the Department of Education, so of course I would think that. In terms of creating accessible data, I think that is where governmental agents creating accessible open data, I think that is where governmental agencies have a role. And then on top of that, I think any public or governmental or quasi-governmental agency has a responsibility to start digging into equity issues and data infrastructures. And so that would be my challenge to those who are here in that kind of realm today. What is it that you're doing if you're producing data, what is it you're doing to make that accessible to your community groups? And then how are you ensuring that is communicated in a way that is accessible to community groups? Because the flip side of that I hear in the planning context in Calgary is that when we do planning engagement, when I talk to planners in Calgary, often they'll show up to community groups and try to use data to explain why they think a particular choice is correct. And that can come across as very patronizing. And so it's this like really tricky space that we're playing in. And I also think that maybe it's, counting bike racks works great, because bike racks, it's there or it's not. And you can say, if we don't have the data, then it's a gap in data. And if we don't have a bike rack, it's a gap in infrastructure. But even there, when we start looking at the experience of using bike racks, where the bike rack is located, all of these things, there's actually a whole bunch of qualitative information about a simple thing like a bike rack that we're not accounting for when we're just counting. And so there's also, I think, a bigger question to be had about how we're doing policy making and the types of information we're privileging. And so my challenge for policymakers, for people who are in positions of power and authority, would be to kind of think about those things critically too. What are you privileging and how you're making your decisions?
Appreciate that. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. I can read them out, or you can read them, or the folks that asked them can read them. So
I would invite the folks who have asked them to participate in if they feel comfortable doing so. So we have one from, is it Armando? That's the first one I am seeing.
Yeah, thank you. I was kind of curious in terms of when you're delivering data to people, there's always a prejudice that we have here that we've heard here for maybe 20 years. Oh, you got your data from Amsterdam or Rotterdam or somewhere else, and now you're telling us we should emulate that. And I'm wondering, that seems to be a very big component of delivering messages. And in particular for Molly, perhaps, when you bring Toronto's values to Calgary, does that work?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think there is something deeply important about doing data and research and engagement and centering storytelling, as KJ was just talking about, and anecdotes and things in the actual communities you're working in, but also not in like asking to keep proving something that has already been proven. And sometimes it has been proven in other jurisdictions, and that can translate over a little bit. I think there is something to be said about this idea that why are we still being asked to prove that cycling can transform communities when we have international other cities in our own country, and then even anecdotes and stories from our own community where we have seen that active transportation and transportation mobility can be transformational for people's lives. So I feel like it's like a little bit of both, but it definitely happens here 100% where people are still pushing that story and pushing solutions from other places onto solutions here. And absolutely in the advocacy world too, there's a like, look how great it is here in Amsterdam, we should do it that way here too. And I don't think it always works. No, not at all. I think there needs to be really local engagement, but I also do think, yeah, asking, it can go both ways, right? I think being critical of that, from making sure we're building for what communities actually need, and then also not letting, because I've had on the flip side, I've been in conversations with less interested counselors or things like that who say like, well, but wait a second, like that's data from Toronto, so like we need our own data from here before we can spend any money on cycling infrastructure. We need our own local data, and then they're asking again for us to prove it when it doesn't need to be proved anymore. Maybe I don't know if that's as clear as mud answer. KJ, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is, so this is a really tricky problem. Maybe I shouldn't use the word problem. That's quite deficit mindset-y of me. I do just want to highlight, we have a great Canadian placemaker in Canada by the name of Jay Pitter, who talks about how trying to impose European models of placemaking in Canadian cities in particular does kind of replicate a previous colonial perception of space. And so, yes, I think we have evidence from other places, and we shouldn't discount that. And when we're doing placemaking in any single location, in any community, we need to attend to what the needs in that community are, because it's very easy to say, well, this is the solution everywhere. And I think what I'm trying to push us towards in terms of thinking about qualitative data is that we're actually looking for more of a pluralistic response. A pluralistic response that meets safety standards and all of those things.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, it was a great question. There is another one here. I think it was Alex was next.
Yeah, I'm currently studying data science at Portland State, and I was wondering, what kind of use cases do you see for those kind of more advanced machine learning, neural nets, etc., data science analysis techniques? I mean, it seems to me like a lot of that stuff isn't necessarily the most helpful for like drawing major conclusions on like larger, like where the data is really easily like you can make these conclusions just seeing it, you know? So I'm wondering if you have any experiences or ideas or thoughts on that.
I could go on for hours in terms of this. I just had the privilege of attending a workshop for the Computer Human Interaction conference that's coming up on human-centered data science. And I do think that there is opportunities to apply machine learning and all of these algorithmic processes, but I am very much in the kind of position of seeing these as often quite critically flawed. And so when we're looking at, and there's a lot of kind of mathematical reasons for that, but I'm going to talk about like the construction of data part, which is what I research and think about, because there are so many gaps in the data that we're using. Anytime we're trying to do big machine learning analysis, we end up reproducing biases. And so part of that's algorithmic bias, part of that's data bias. I actually think we need to be focusing on getting better data from agencies. That does not mean, however, so if the one map I had where I kind of showed a cluster, you could do a clustering analysis in a like a machine learning, in a data analysis sense. You could do a clustering analysis on that actually I didn't, because that was not the point of this project, but you could do that I think, given the distribution of the data points, would show that there are clusters of the population that is either being excluded in Toronto from data collection or from bike infrastructure, one of the two, I don't know. And so I think you could use those tools as ways to highlight existing problems, but then when we start looking at how we aggregate people, there's a whole bunch of kind of big challenges there. So again, I don't necessarily have a clear answer. I do think that data has a role to play. I think that the role that it needs to play is one of both self-reflexivity and criticality, but also using that tool, that strength, that access to, you know, speaking the language of power to try and reorient the conversations that we're having. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just thinking that I feel like there are definitely a lot of use cases where, because with the using analysis of photographs and live video feed and stuff like that, where you could use the machine learning to get better data to then be able to perform more complicated analysis.
Well, and interestingly, like they tried to do photographic analysis to come up with a data set in Calgary for our sidewalks, but our technology isn't at the point where that's possible, so we still don't have a sidewalk map.
Lovely.
So yeah.
Thank you.
I think then, yeah, great question. The next question was from Gabriella.
Hi, yeah, sorry, fighting with my headset. Yeah, I was wondering, and I did show up a little bit late, so apologies if I missed this. I was wondering about how we balance the use of data, like with transportation justice and moving forward equitable mobility, knowing that it can often hide or minimize the inequities faced by traditionally excluded populations. Like we talk about at the city of Portland using race as starting with race when it comes to equity, but it's a very small percentage of the population. And so it can be very hidden. We do that type of outreach and that data collection. And so just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a key issue when we start trying to have equity conversations with data, and that is that we tend to, data analysis is almost always about aggregating people. And aggregation is almost always sort of an emotionally violent process, in that we're saying, you are now this category and you're this category and nothing else. And so that is part of what I'm trying to address with my work, is how do we talk about data science and use it as a tool without then replicating the past harms. And I think it's going to be a lifelong process to make that possible. I do think that we need to be using it because it is the language that's being used, but I think that's where and I don't know where you came in. So what I'm trying to talk about in my work is how do we present and how do we represent data so that part of that representation is actually starting to make visible the fact that any data representation is a fundamentally politically constructed process because the data that we're using is politically constructed. And I don't have conclusions yet. This will be my like life's work. So but that is I think one of the ways that we can take it is recognizing that we live and work within a system where we are constrained by having to talk about people and very real people, individuals in this like aggregate that completely kind of invisibilizes what's happening, and that exists along, you know, ableism and disability and racial categories and gender categories and all of these different categories. I'm not sure that answers your question. I'm not sure I have a complete answer to that question. Molly, maybe you have something to add. I'm just too excited here.
No, I agree. I think that is like one of my, as an advocate, one of my like fundamental questions. And I think part of it is moving away from such a desire and a need to prove things. Like data is incredibly useful. And I think when we've got folks operating in the data science world that are asking these kinds of questions, I'm super grateful that they're there. But I do think part of it is just like shifting away from of data being the only, this particular type of data of like prove who is riding bikes so that we know putting dollars into infrastructure will be useful. It's like changing that narrative a little bit to make sure that we recognize and just move to believe that having cities that have access to multimodal modes of transportation for everybody in the city is just like essential and necessary. And it's like, I find as an advocate, it's like trying to stay in that headspace that's aspirational, and what can we do to get to that place where it's just like believed that we need these things and we need to build them, and we need to make sure they're built everywhere, and then we need to make sure they're built with community actively participating, and they're not built in ways that are gentrifying people's communities and causing harm. But then also the reality that as an advocate right now, I still have to have some kind of data to prove in certain circumstances to speak the language of our colonial systems that still ask for that kind of language. And so since I don't believe that's going to go away anytime soon, nor that it maybe should, I feel hope and excitement when I'm invited into KJ's data lab and they are having these kinds of conversations while also studying and being such cool data nerds, that I just like, I like that. And there's some frustration, and I feel like I feel that same wall that you feel, but I feel some sense of hope that we will be critical about the data and then also try to shift a lens that this type of really specific measured data isn't the only way to make good decisions about what is needed where in our cities. I don't know, that's also maybe clear as kind of wishy-washy and an unclear answer, but that's my thoughts.
We're hopeful for the future on that. Like, it's inspiring, yes. Right? Yeah. I'm so appreciative of you both. Thank you so much, Molly and KJ. How can people get in contact with you if they want to follow up?
I had our email addresses on our slides, and I will put them in the chat right here as well.
Perfect.
And thank you so much, Andre, for amazing moderation.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks to all.